Okay, so recording's on. Yeah, very warm welcome to everyone who's here today and who's watching on the recording. So this is our Get Started On CV360 session, part of our Get Started On sort of workshops that we do to kind of basically communicate on digital tools that we have available through our careers website. As mentioned a couple of minutes ago to people not on the recording, I'm Chris Webb. I'm a Senior Employability Advisor with the Sheffield Hallam Careers and Employability Service, bit of a mouthful there. And I'm joined by my colleague, Bianca Roberts, who's below me on Zoom somewhere, and can maybe give us a wave on the recording. Fantastic. So this session really is all about CV360, which is a really, really useful digital tool that we have available for free for both students and graduates at Sheffield Hallam through our careers website. And what I'm going to be doing in the session today is kind of taking you through what the system is, how it works, and a little bit about why it might be useful in terms of supporting with your kind of employability. I'm then going to do a live demo of the platform and give plenty of opportunities for questions to come through. In terms of questions, quick sort of note on that. If you've got kind of questions as we go throughout the session, please do pop them in the chat. You can either put them in the Zoom chat to everyone if you're happy with everyone seeing your question, or ideally send them privately to Bianca. You'll see Bianca's name on Zoom. And you can then send her the questions. Bianca can kind of pick those up and obviously feed them back to me through the session so that we can kind of answer them at a good pace. So yeah, any questions, do make sure you pop them in the Zoom chat. We're also not opposed to people coming on camera, unmuting to ask questions, but just be aware that we are recording the session. So you could appear on the recording if you come on camera. So a little bit just to begin with on what CV360 is. You know, the name doesn't necessarily give too much away other than it's something to do with CVs. So essentially, CV360 is kind of a mock applicant tracking system. So applicant tracking systems are sort of software used by recruiters and employers in order to kind of make sort of checks, a number of different checks on CVs to kind of filter through that first stage of the application process. So CV360 scores against more than kind of 50 different types of checks that are commonly identified by an applicant tracking system, and we'll come on to what some of those checks are moving forward. And these are the sort of things that could potentially stop your CV from moving through to the next stage of an application process. And we'll talk a little bit about what types of companies might use this sort of software moving forward. The great thing about the system is it allows you to get kind of instant detailed feedback on the CV, and you can upload as many different CVs as you want. So different formats, Microsoft Word, PDF, and also kind of maybe different ones that you might be using, whether that's for kind of placements, part-time jobs, graduate jobs, or different industries. So really useful tool, completely free to use. That's the benefits. And we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of how it works and why we have it, basically. So for people who maybe aren't so familiar with applicant tracking systems, this is electronic software used by a number of different kind of recruiters, employers. Again, as I say, is a bit of a first stage tool when it comes to sort of reviewing people's applications. So the reason that companies tend to use this, often with kind of larger companies, is it might be that they have, you know, several hundreds or even thousands of applicants for a role, and there has to be a way of them kind of quickly being able to sort of filter down applications without actually manually reading every single one. So what the applicant tracking system does is it essentially has a number of checks that we're going to look at today, which allow the sort of software to kind of pick out which would be the most appropriate CVs and which would be less appropriate. So it might sound a little bit kind of robotic, you know, perhaps a little bit of a sort of non-kind of human system, but there is a reason behind it. It's for kind of, you know, dealing with large quantities of applications. And as we'll see, as we kind of look at the system itself, it's not necessarily excluding people for reasons that aren't, you know, known. There are kind of key things you can do to ensure that actually, if your CV does go through an applicant tracking system at any point, you're doing the best you can in order for it to kind of hit the things that it's checking. So there are things we can do to kind of work around the system, and this is exactly what CV360 does as a tool. So a question that we often get back is, you know, is every CV I'm ever going to send only going to be checked by a machine, or is it only going to be checked by a robot? Not necessarily. So it really does depend on where you're applying and what type of opportunity you're applying for. So for example, if you've ever applied for a job through job sites like Indeed, you might find that will have gone through an applicant tracking system. Again, it may be that a recruiter has seen the CV, but it may be that the first stage, it gets kind of filtered through so that the recruiter only has a smaller number of CVs to kind of manually check or manually look through. So it's certainly not the case that every time you send a CV, it's going to be looked at by an applicant tracking system. But it is quite important to be aware that this can happen, and some of the places where it might be more likely to happen. So for example, if you're applying for a particularly competitive graduate or placement scheme where you know there's going to be sort of hundreds or thousands of applicants, it's reasonable to assume that you could be putting your CV through an applicant tracking system. If, for example, you're putting it through an online kind of portal, so from a company website or through Indeed or other job sites, again, it's reasonable to kind of assume that you could be having your CV assessed by an applicant tracking system. However, if you're sending something across to a recruiter, you've got the name of the person, you've got their email address, things can be kind of quite different. And we'll talk a little bit more later about different types of CVs and why they might not be appropriate for things like CV360. So it's certainly not kind of one size fits all, but it's really worth being aware of applicant tracking systems, knowing that they exist and knowing what CV360 can do to kind of help you prepare your CV a little bit better. I've also included an article on this slide, which we'll send across with the recording following the session today, which just gives you a good overview from the JobScan website about what you need to know about applicant tracking systems. Quite useful if you've never come across them before. So like I say, before we kind of go into the demo, just a few sort of caveats about CV360, a few things that it's important to be aware of. As I say, you know, CV360 is a useful tool, but it's useful for preparing CVs specifically for applicant tracking systems. You will get some value out of it beyond that, so it will still help with refining your CV for sending on to, you know, individual recruiters, for example. But there are some things to be aware of. So on the right-hand side of the page, you'll see that I've got a bit more of a creative CV. This is kind of for a graphic design related role. Now, a lot of those kind of CVs from the creative industries can tend to take or adopt a bit more of a sort of creative approach, something that's more in line with the companies or the organizations they might be applying for. This does not go down well with CV360. It's there to kind of monitor Word, PDF, simple traditional structured CVs. So if you put something like that into CV360, it won't like it at all, but that certainly doesn't mean that the quality of the CV is not good. So it's worth kind of bearing in mind that CV360 is very much there to look at CVs the way that a computer, the way an applicant tracking system does. But it's really important to remember that what you send across to an employer should really be tailored ideally for their industry and tailored towards what they're looking for. So again, that's where the research you do into the company and into the employer will kind of make you understand, you know, what might they be looking for? Are they looking for something more traditional or would they be looking for something perhaps a little bit more creative and innovative? So the one size fits all approach is worth remembering for CVs in general. And the other thing that's worth remembering is, you know, this is really just a starting point. So CV360 can help you to get a baseline of what your CV is looking like. Are there any kind of key structural things or formatting things that you might need to change? But what we would really recommend, and I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, is booking an appointment with one of our employability advisors to kind of get a bit more sort of advice and guidance regarding the tailoring of the CV and making sure that it's kind of matched and appropriate for the types of roles that you're applying for. So just a kind of few things to mention before we look at the system itself. So without further ado, we'll actually kind of get onto the system and show you where it is and how it works. And I'll do all of these steps as a live demo as well, so you can kind of see what I'm doing. And also, if you want to kind of do this at the same time on your own computer or via your phone, please do so. So to kind of get onto CV360, it's fairly straightforward. If you go to our main Sheffield Hallam Careers website, which is shu.ac.uk/careers, you'll see on the right-hand side, there's a toolbar with a button called Resources. If you click on Resources, you'll find our Careers Centre 360 at the very, very top of that page. And if you click on that, it will take you to a login page where you can log in using your student or staff login details. Obviously, we're talking students here. So again, it's just students or staff, but it gives you the chance to use your Sheffield Hallam details and log into the system. You can also continue using this system as a graduate. So if we've got any graduates who are here with us today for the workshop, there is a special section on the graduates page on our careers website, which tells you how to get the graduate login for Careers Centre 360, which is how you then access CV360. So again, if you are a graduate, you're on the call, let us know, and we can kind of explain that process in a bit more detail. Once you get onto the platform, again, it's really straightforward. There's a wide variety of kind of resources you can access, which we're not going to go into detail about today because there's a huge amount on there. E-learning modules, online kind of employability self-assessments, video interview simulators. There's a lot to look through. And so we're obviously going to focus on CV360, but do kind of take a look around Careers Centre. It's a really big platform, lots on there to explore. If you go to the Career Tools section, though, on Careers Centre 360, you'll see that there's a full kind of menu, and CV360 is the second one down. Again, I'll show you all of this live in a second, and this is how you access the tool itself. So I'm going to pause the recording quickly while I change over screens, and then we're going to show you a live demo of all of this. But if you've got any questions while I'm doing that, please feel free to pop them in the chat. Okay, so we're now on the Careers and Employability website. As I say, straight through the main Sheffield Hallam web pages, just shu.ac.uk/careers. You can see that at the top. If you go to the resources tab on the right hand side, again, as I mentioned, it will take you to this page here. Careers Centre 360 is at the very top. And then once you get onto there, as I say, it will give you that login portal where you just sign on with your Sheffield Hallam details. This will then take you through to the main Careers Centre, which again has got all of these different tools that you can access, some of which are kind of broken down into some boxes for you to make things a little bit easier. And it also connects you to a lot of the other support that we offer through the careers team, so our appointments as well. But what we're going to be looking at is CV360, which you can find under the career tools section on the top. So once you get onto CV360, this is kind of what it looks like. It's got a nice little sort of blurb summary at the beginning, which again sort of explains what applicant tracking systems are and how they work. There's also quite a nice sort of 2.5 minute, 3 minute animated video, which again just gives a bit of an overview about applicant tracking systems. What you then have the opportunity to do is upload a copy of your CV. Again, this can be in Microsoft Word or PDF format. Doesn't necessarily matter which one, although Word I think usually tends to work better, but you know, really both will kind of have the same effect. And what you'll sort of see immediately once you've uploaded the CV is it will come back with a score, and it will come back with an overview of how many checks it's made on your CV, which we'll look at in more detail in a second. And it will tell you how many of these you've kind of passed in inverted commas, how many you've failed in inverted commas. So important thing to remember with all of this is that the kind of the pass and fail language is, you know, perhaps a little bit negative. It's a little bit harsh. If you get, for example, lower than 50% on your CV, it doesn't necessarily mean that the CV is really bad. It might just mean that there's some kind of formatting or structural issues that it's worth tweaking or kind of changing. So ignore the kind of pass and failed language. Really, this is a way to kind of get an idea of what's your CV like as a baseline in terms of how the information is kind of set out, formatted, structured, and we'll come through those checks in a minute. And really kind of just an opportunity for you to sort of say, okay, where's my CV at the moment? What changes can I make already? And then from there, is there anything else I can do to ensure it's kind of directly tailored or adapted to the type of job or type of company that I'm applying for? So this is kind of the main screen that you get. Once you've kind of entered the CV and you've got the score, you go into view feedback. And what happens is it will take you to a page where it will show you in a bit more detail why you've kind of got that score and a bit of an overview of how you can potentially change it. So at the top, again, it gives you sort of a general summary and the score that we talked about already. It gives you an overview of the feedback. So again, it talks about, for example, you know, what does a computer understand about your CV when it reads it? So for my one, for example, it talks about my experience being strongly concentrated in employability skills. Great, okay, that's pretty much what I want it to do. And slightly concentrated in human resources, which is not really anything to do with anything I've done in the past. So it sometimes can kind of pick things out that you think, okay, maybe I need to look at that and look at how that's worded on the CV. It's also picked out how many years of experience I've had. It's also talked about kind of, you know, it's noticed that I've got some management level roles in there. So again, you know, it's sort of picking out the things that the computer will see. Obviously, from a recruiter's perspective, an individual person's perspective, they might see things quite differently, but it's good to know that this is how an applicant tracking system views it. You can also see a full view of an ATS version of a CV. So this is how the computer actually breaks up the CV when it sort of receives it. And that's quite useful to look at as well, just to get an idea of, you know, what your CV would look like if it's being put through one of these systems. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break down the different areas that the checks that are done on the CV through CV360. I'm going to sort of explain how these work and then explain sort of, you know, why they might be useful or why they might be things to consider. And then at the end, or kind of during this process, obviously, please ask any questions that you might have, and we can kind of pick them up as we go along. So the first section is kind of file. This one is sort of fairly self-explanatory, fairly straightforward. So it's just taking a minute to load. For each section that it does checks on, you've got a transcript and you've got a video which sort of explains what that section is looking for or what the checks are looking for. So that's quite useful just as a starting point. But you can see for some of these, it really is kind of quite common sense. So for example, they're checking whether your CV is the right sort of type of document. Is it, you know, a Word document? Is it PDF? You know, if, for example, it's in a completely different format, so it might be kind of there as a JPEG, as a picture image, it will pick that up and suggest why that might not be a good thing. You can see the CV that I uploaded is an old one from about 3 years ago. And again, the check has picked that up to say, okay, it looks like you've not edited this any more than 3 years ago. What's going on there? And so that's kind of just showing to the employer that, okay, maybe has there been nothing you've done since then? Is there nothing you've actually done to update it or edit your CV since 3 years ago? What's kind of been going on? So it is kind of a useful thing to do. It sounds like quite a simple common sense thing, but again, it will kind of pick up some of those things for you. It will also pick up things, for example, like the name of the file. So a lot of people will label a CV that they send over to a company maybe with just their name. They might not even include CV in the title, and that can be problematic. That's something that the machine picks up as well. So the file side is fairly straightforward. Presentation, this one's a little bit different, but again, some quite simple changes, simple tweaks that you can make. So for example, number of pages, we would typically say for most industries, a maximum of 2 pages is a good length for a CV. Obviously, it doesn't have to be a line in the sand. There are certain types of CVs, for example, academic CVs that might be a little bit longer. Certain industries, like we talked about with creative industries, where it might be kind of 1-page CVs in a slightly different format. So the 2 pages is not something that has to be hard and fast, but it is just something to be aware of, that it's quite a good industry standard to stick by. The sort of presentation section of CV360 also then kind of picks up on certain things like the number of words in your CV. So again, is it quite long? Have you got quite a lot of text in there? Is there not a lot of white space, to kind of break up the text that you've got? So all these things can kind of come across as being relatively, straightforward, relatively simple, but you'd be amazed how many people don't do them. And so this is quite a good way for you to just pick out things like, have you got enough white space on your CV? Are there enough blank areas so that the eye is kind of drawn to different bits of information? So there's some really kind of useful, just starting checks that you can do through these sections. Moving on to the slightly more kind of important aspects, or the aspects that require maybe a little bit more detail. The structure side looks at kind of the way that the CV is sort of formatted. So what type of sections do you have in here? So for example, it gives the sort of basic sections that they would expect to see on a CV. Things like your personal profile, so a bit at the top about yourself, your education, your work experience, key skills, references. So it will kind of check your CV to see if you talk about those sections at all. It also will kind of pick up if you've not included something. So for example, if it doesn't see any reference to work experience or education, it will say, okay, well, why is that not there? Now, it might be because you've titled it in a different way, like I've called it employment history instead of work experience. But that can be a good thing to know if you're sort of sending a CV through an applicant tracking system. It will also sort of make sure that you've got things like contact details in there. Again, fairly sort of simple things, but quite important. And it will check whether you've repeated sections by accident, or you've kind of, maybe got 2 sections talking about work experience, relevant experience, additional experience. Again, this doesn't necessarily have to be a problem, but it's just there to kind of pick up, this is what the machine sees and what it might flag on the system. It'll also kind of check for the dominance of each section. So for example, if your personal profile, so your little about me section at the top of the CV, if that was taking up the majority of your CV, that would probably be quite problematic, because it's not really giving you enough space to talk about your achievements, your work experience, education. So with that kind of in mind, it's useful to just see, okay, which of these sections are kind of taking up the most space? And that's something that the check does for you as well. The content section looks at what's in there, so what's in each section that you've kind of included in the CV. And again, it kind of picks out, have you got your name on here? Simple things like contact details, phone, email, do you have addresses on here? It also kind of picks out whether you've got a LinkedIn profile, which again is a really useful thing to make sure that you've got on the CV. And it also checks if you've got other social media links that you could include. So sometimes CV360 can just be quite a nice prompt to say, okay, have you got, for example, if you've got a website or a blog or a portfolio, have you included it on the CV? So sometimes it's just there as a bit of a reminder of things you could put on there. It also sort of breaks down the sections, and again, we'll kind of pick up simple sort of formatting things around, have you got your dates for your education? Have you got sort of details about, the skills that you developed in education, the names of the subjects you studied? So again, fairly sort of simple things. And it will also kind of pick out that for other sections as well, so things like work experience too. Again, it mentions a personal profile in here. I've included this as a good example of one that is definitely too long, too many words really. A personal profile should be around, ideally, anywhere maybe between sort of 4 to 6 lines. It's just a simple kind of about me summary. So in this case, the CV360 has kind of picked up that I've got a personal profile, but it's kind of mentioned there it's a short summary. So again, that might just be something to consider. And again, it's kind of mentioned here that personal profile is quite long, a bit longer than we typically expect. So it can go into quite a lot of depth, CV360. It might seem like it's almost too much depth, but again, these are kind of quite simple, easy tweaks you can make just to make the CV as effective as possible. The final two sections are probably, I would say, the most important in terms of making kind of meaningful changes to the CV itself. So the first one is about skills. So this looks at where you've talked about the skills that you have within a CV. Now, the reason this is particularly important is where you can really make a lot of changes that help your CV to get through an applicant tracking system are doing that research into the job vacancy, the job description, and making sure that the skills you're talking about match up to what the employer is looking for in their job description. That's usually what the applicant tracking systems will be doing, checking for keywords, checking for things that match up to the roles that you're applying for. So for example, CV360 will pick out what skills have you actually talked about, what actually appears within your CV. And it can break these up into different topics as well. So whether it's technical skills, whether it's transferable skills, whether it's industry specific skills, it will kind of pick those things apart. Now, one thing that's really interesting is it will actually look at skill dominance as well. So how much do you talk about one particular skill? So for example, in my CV, it's really picking out communication and interpersonal skills, which is, again, pretty good. That's what I want. A lot of the jobs that I've done have involved communication, interpersonal skills. A lot of the jobs that I would be applying for would require those skills. So that's absolutely fine. However, for you, you might put your CV in and it might bring up the same set of skills when actually you're applying for a role where what's more desirable might be technical skills, or that might be the most important skill set they want you to communicate. So it's really useful just to check this, what comes across on the CV, which skills are the most important on your CV, and does that match up to the type of jobs you're applying for? It also kind of breaks down as well some of the kind of common employability skills that you might need sort of in the workplace, and do those appear on your CV. So again, it's always worth kind of matching this up against the jobs you're applying for, but this is quite a useful tool that you can use just to check what's on your CV versus some of the key skills employers are often looking for in the workplace. And then the final section that we've got is the language section. So again, this is a bit of a mixture. So some of this is kind of quite basic stuff around spelling, punctuation, grammar. So again, really useful things to make sure that you've checked before you send off your CV to an employer. And one thing that's worth mentioning is it can pick up on the system spellings that aren't incorrect because they're words that it doesn't understand. So again, you can check that. You'll know whether those words are real words or whether they're incorrect spellings. So for example, we've got something like Careers Inc. here. That's the name of the company. I know that's a real company, so I don't need to worry about changing that. The other side is it will also kind of pick out, and this is slightly more important, the language that you're using. So for example, are you using the same words maybe too often? Are you using enough action words? So when you're talking about your achievements, are you kind of really talking about it from an action standpoint? So you created, delivered, organized, developed, or are you sort of saying, I had to do this, I had to do that. So it's kind of quite good at sort of picking out, okay, are you sort of talking about your achievements in a very action focused way? You did this, you delivered on this, or are you not kind of really describing your achievements in that way at all? And that's a really important thing for kind of any CV really, is you're focusing on, the achievements, what you did and how you made a difference. And again, even though CV360 can't go into detail about that, like we could in a conversation with an employability advisor, it can at least pick up, are you using kind of action-focused words within your CV itself? It'll also pick up the most used words or repeated phrases. So if you're repeating yourself a lot, again, it's really useful to know about that. And then you can kind of take that out if needed. And it will also kind of pick up, sentence structure. If, for example, you've got quite a lot of long sentences, they tend to be more difficult to read on a CV, whereas kind of shorter, punchier sort of bullet points, often a bit easier for recruiters and employers to pick out. So there's a lot of great content in there. It even tells you how long it would take to read your CV, which is, again, measuring against what a recruiter or employer might typically look at. The average being around 2 to 3 minutes. And again, if yours is a bit longer to read, it might be worth considering, is it too text heavy? Could you condense some of it with bullet points and kind of shorter sort of points of interest? So that is the CV360. Those are the kind of checks that it undertakes, which mimic a lot of the applicant tracking system checks. So that really kind of takes us to the end of sort of the demonstration. We're going to kind of round off the recording, round off the session in a minute, just with a couple of sort of final messages. But are there any questions in the meantime that people have regarding CV360 that we can kind of go through? And I'll pause the recording just while we kind of wait to hear those back. Okay, so just before we finish, a really good point that came through in the chat was around, when you might choose to use CV360. And again, I think it's worth mentioning, it's very much kind of a first sort of step tool. It's a really good way to kind of get a sort of baseline. How's your CV looking? Are there simple changes you can make? Once you've kind of gone through that, it's then really useful to then go and see an employability advisor to talk a little bit more about the idea of tailoring or adapting the CV to particular job roles. But if you can go to an employability advisor appointment having already done this through CV360, it's incredibly helpful because it just means you'll be able to maximize your time in terms of the CV conversations you have. So that sort of brings us really kind of to the end of the session. Just a reminder that the Careers Centre 360, which is where you can find CV360, has got loads and loads of other really useful resources, particularly around CVs as well, that you can kind of check out. There's some online learning modules all about putting together effective CVs, and actually a CV builder tool that helps you create a CV that is specifically tailored towards applicant tracking systems. So you put in the information and it actually pulls the CV together for you. So some really, really useful stuff there. Again, I'll include the links in the slides that we'll send out to everyone who's attended the session. Again, this was a comment that came back in the chat. Worth remembering, CV360 is really just the kind of the starting point. If you want to get that more sort of individual tailored support with CV advice, that's where you can book an appointment with people in our team. Some of these photos are out of date, fair warning, we've got some new people in the team now, but this is all the information about how you can book an appointment with our employability advisors. Every single student here with us will have a named employability advisor connected to your course. So Bianca mentioned she's connected to computing, I'm connected to art and design, for example. And we have appointments available throughout the week via phone, Zoom, and now face-to-face as well. So again, to book an appointment, all the information's there on the slide that I provided and the link that I'll send through after the session. And again, just a reminder that we've got plenty more of these sessions kind of coming up over this semester and throughout the rest of the academic year, all available to book on Handshake, where obviously you booked onto this session. And a lot of these get started on kind of short, quick fire sessions, including things like LinkedIn, Graduates First, which is where you can practice psychometric tests, so kind of online numerical verbal reasoning tests, and also kind of ones on tools for career planning. So basically making the most of the digital tools that we have for free that you can use at Sheffield Hallam. If you need any more sort of help or advice, again, you can get through to us in a variety of different ways. We've got a phone number for the careers team, we have our email address, and of course we've got the website that I talked about earlier. And we're also around. You can find us on social media, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn and Facebook, where we give updates about a lot of our upcoming events, and upcoming opportunities that people can get involved in. But that sort of really brings us to the end of the session. I'm sorry, we've run over a couple of minutes there. I'll stop the recording now, and if anyone's got any other questions, please feel free to hang on the line and we'll pick them up.